is Ron Zorn. I grew up in South Carolina. I went to a liberal arts college, University of South Carolina, majored in history, minored in English, lit, and psychology, went on to seminary. I went to seminary because I wanted to understand more about who Jesus was and what the faith was about. I had no intention of being a minister. I just wanted to learn more. When I finished seminary, I realized there was a lot more I needed to know and wanted to know, so I went on into graduate school, got a PhD in biblical languages and biblical literature. And when I finished that, I realized I had more questions than answers even then. So I've spent the most of my life studying and in the process teaching and pastoring. And now I'm retired and I'm writing a blog trying to pull together a lot of ideas. And I'm very active in a progressive church that is open and affirming and is about being a welcoming church and building a just community and a sustainable world. And my wife and I, we've been married since 1973. It'll be 46 years, July 21st. And we have a daughter and 2 grandsons and a son. So there's a little bit about me. I grew up in a Southern Baptist tradition, but that was when Southern Baptist actually could be moderate. It was before the fundamentalists took over the denomination in the 70s. We had educated clergy. The pastor I had when I was a teenager did not believe in hell, which is a shock for many people. He never preached revivals, had no use for that. And so I grew up knowing that there was more than what many Southern Baptists thought. But I progressed, I think I would call it a progression from that, as I began to question many of the things that did still bother me. And I spent years studying, reading, trying to understand more about the faith. And I guess I've always been puzzled why people cannot get excited about the whole issue of God. Because this is it. I mean, what is more important? But then I also grieve over the fact that so many concepts of God are sick. And I've known people a lot better than the images that many people have of God. So one thing I've tried to do is present an image of God and of the faith that is healing and joyful and loving and including, as opposed to one that is so negative and condemning. So that's a little bit about my background and where I'm from and what's happening.
So what would you say to people who have grown up in a church, had a bad experience, decided that their tradition wasn't for them anymore, and so they've decided to move on without religion in their life? Is there anything else out there that you would recommend? Or?
Okay. I have a a sermon entitled "The Best Kept Secret in the Church." And the best kept secret in the church is Jesus. I'm talking about what he said, what he did, what he meant. Most people in churches really don't have a clue as to what's going on with Jesus. And I fault the clergy for that. They've done a terrible job in presenting who Jesus is, what he's about, what he taught, what he meant. And so if you grew up in a church where that wasn't presented, and instead you get a distorted gospel, then the healthiest response that you can have is to leave it. If I had to choose between believing in a God that so many fundamentalists and ultra-conservative Christians believe in, or being an atheist, I would be an atheist. I think that would be a healthier choice. But I don't have to make that choice. And I think it's very sad that so many people don't know that there's a healthy choice out there. It's not presented. It's not on the airwaves. It's not what you're going to get usually on Facebook. It is there. And if you make a concerted effort, you can find it. You can find places where you're free to question, free to doubt. Places where actually doubt is seen as a positive thing, because doubt allows your faith to grow. I know in my own case, that's what has happened. doubts came up, and that allowed me to abandon thoughts that were not healthy and to embrace new thoughts, and to discover along the way that for 2,000 years there have been people who have been thinking that way. I just didn't know it. I mean, there's a depth to Christianity that American Christianity doesn't even touch. So it's there. To me, the heart of the Christian faith, and this is what, if the church isn't proclaiming this, then I would say to those people, run the other way. The heart of the Christian faith revolves around who Jesus is and the sense that he shows us the character of God. If you're a Christian, what you're really saying is, I believe Jesus reveals to us who God is. And what does Jesus reveal? Jesus reveals, in the New Testament's unanimous about this, that God is love. God's love is unconditional, which means that nothing you do or don't do will ever change God's love for you. God's love is indiscriminate. That means that God does not love any human being on the face of the earth more than God loves you. But God doesn't love you any more than God loves every other person on the earth. God's love is self-giving. I used to say sacrificial, but there's so many connotations to that about atonement that I don't go there anymore. Self-giving, just like a parent has to give of self in raising a child. And God's love is everlasting. It's never going to change. It's never going to die. If those four characteristics are not presented in a church about who God is, then, yeah, the healthiest response is to leave. So, along with that, the New Testament scholar Marcus Borg shows that the number one characteristic of God, according to Jesus, is compassion. Now, if you look that up in the Gospels, you're not going to find many times the word compassion occurs. You will find the word mercy or merciful. Unfortunately, mercy and merciful has a different meaning for us from compassion. Mercy is what you show to someone who actually has done something bad or wrong, but you're willing to forgive them, and it's a condescending attitude. No, the idea behind Jesus' words is compassion. And the Hebrew root for the word compassion goes back to the womb of a mother. It's womb love, W-O-M-B, the uterus, the womb, where the woman carries the child. It's the kind of love a mother feels for her child. You hurt that child, you hurt that mother, perhaps even more so. That is the kind of love that I think Jesus was talking about. Because love in the abstract can mean a lot of things. I love chocolate ice cream and chocolate cake. That's not the same as compassion. Compassion is putting yourself in the place of the other person, feeling what's going on, sensing what they're going through, then stepping back and doing what you can to give them relief, to help them in any way. Compassion always includes that action. If there's no action, there's no compassion. Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan is an indication of that. He showed compassion and did all these things. So it's a compassionate love. And even though Jesus calls God Abba, Aramaic for daddy, Papa, the number one characteristic of God, according to Jesus, is a feminine characteristic, compassion. And so if Christianity is not compassionate, it knows nothing of God. And tragically, a lot of Christianity and a lot of church history, there has been very little compassion. A lot of condemnation, but no compassion. There are churches out there who are living this example of compassion, this concern for justice, of correcting oppression, this unconditional love where all are welcome, and you can express your doubts and no one condemns you. They're out there, and I would encourage people who are searching to make an effort and look around, because they're there, and you will find a place where your faith can grow, where you will be a part of a community that genuinely cares about you, and you can be a part of something far bigger than you could ever be by yourself. It's there. You just have to look for it. The churches that aren't that way, in my opinion, in a few decades, they will be dead and gone. They will be totally irrelevant. And they should be dead and gone. I don't think God really cares whether a church or a denomination exists or does not. God cares as to whether they are faithful to that love, to that compassion, to that justice, to that caring. And if they're not, then the world's better off without them. The church, unfortunately, has always been at the tail end, in many cases, over issues that have plagued humanity, like slavery, the position of women, the LGBTQ community. And it's like a caboose on a train. It's the engine is driving in front, and the church is never there, or rarely there. There are times when they were, but there are exceptions. The church is on the caboose, the very end. So my question to people today is, when you see a train, how many times do you see a caboose? You only see them in museums or fairs where they have old trains you can ride. You don't see cabooses on real trains anymore. They don't serve a purpose. And I think a church that continually is at the end and joins at the last minute, for example, with the LGBTQ community. You had to have will and grace and queer eye for the straight guy and all that. And finally, some of the churches, and not even all of those, said, yeah, we'll join. Now the majority has, we'll go that way. Instead of being on the cutting edge, which is what I think we could be if we would. Because the world needs a lot of help today. We're so opposed to much of science, but it's foolish, to question things like evolution and the genetic engineering and all that. What we need to be is helping science understand the ethical implications of what's done. They need that. But they're not going to listen to somebody who can't believe in climate change or can't believe in genetics or can't believe in evolution and who believes the world was created 10,000 years ago. They can't listen to that. But they can listen to someone who can accept evolution, who can accept genetics, who can accept all these other things that science is discovering, and at the same time offer some ethical guidance. Because if we don't, what will the future do with genetic engineering if there are no ethical guidelines? And science is void of that. Devoid of it. There's none of it there. They need help from the outside. So we could be on the cutting edge instead of being the caboose, which will become irrelevant.
What would you say to people who feel that science now has disproven God and made the God concept and certainly religion completely irrelevant? What about the scientists who say, and atheistic philosophers who say, well, we've disproven all that anyway, so you really need to find your ethics somewhere else. You have to create something all new. Why do you feel, you criticize part of Christianity, but why do you still believe in God, or why do you still think that's viable?
Right. Two answers to that. One is more intellectual, the other is more personal. My understanding of science, and I took a lot of science in college, biology, zoology, chemistry, physics, I don't know if I mentioned geology, but that was an important one to see about the age of the Earth. Science is guided by what is called the scientific principle. And with the scientific principle, you discover and you do your work through experiments, through observations, through measurements, through relating all these, and you have to be able to replicate that. For example, if you thought that you had discovered a cure for colon cancer, and you're all excited about that, and you present your results to other scientists, if they can replicate that, then you can claim to have discovered the cure for colon cancer. But if they can't, then something was bogus about your procedure. So science is constantly correcting itself. And it can only deal with that which is measured. that which you can observe, that which you can experiment with. You can't put God in a test tube. You can't measure God. You remember the cosmonauts when they went up, they said in the heavens, they said they didn't see God. Well, no one in the church has believed in God's up there that way for I don't know how long. So science is only equipped to answer questions that can be answered through the scientific method. Once it goes beyond that, then it's moved into what is called scientific positivism, which states the only thing that is real is what we can measure and experiment with and prove in the laboratory. That's an assumption. That's not a discovery, that's an assumption that only the material works, only material is real. And so and once they say that, they've moved beyond science. They're no longer operating in science. They've come to a conclusion. If there is a God who is the creator, and if that God is transcendent, meaning God is more than the universe, as well as immanent, meaning God is present in the universe, then if you think about it, you will never discover God through science, because God is beyond all that. Science starts at the bottom and builds from the bottom up, and therefore it's never going to get to the transcendent dimension. It can get to mystery and say, well, one possible explanation of all this is there is a mind behind it and a God behind it. And there are scientists who've done that. But they will be quick to tell you that's not a scientific discovery. That's just something they've come to believe in light of the evidence. And it's a faith statement. So science cannot prove or disprove God. Those who say they have proven God through science are wrong, and those who've said they've disproven God through science are wrong. There are scientists, John Polkinghorne, funny name, Polkinghorne, was a quantum physicist, taught at Cambridge in England, then became an Anglican priest, and he's been very active in relating science to religion. And he finds that in all the mysteries he's discovered, that it's reasonable to assume there is a God behind it, but he can't prove that. He knows that. He says that. So science can answer, and this is an old answer to that question, but I think it's still helpful. It can answer questions of how, what, when, where. Religion can't answer those questions. But religion and philosophy can address questions of why. Not why in the sense of cause and effect, but why in the sense of purpose. The why questions are the questions that eat us alive as human beings. Nobody goes out and blows their brains out over how, what, when, where. It's always the why. It's a human question. It's what makes us human. And science is not equipped to answer that question. It can answer how, what, when, and where, but not why. And that's the human question. That's what eats us alive. That's what makes life human itself. That's the mystery. We ask those questions. I think of cavemen and cavewomen thousands and thousands of years ago looking up at the stars and wondering, what are they, and how do they relate to us, and who are we? You get that in the Psalms, in Psalm 8. When I look at the sun, the moon, the stars, which you remain, who are we that you're mindful of us, that you care about us? That's been the human question, I think, before history was ever recorded, all the way back to maybe even Neanderthals, because we now know that they had some concept of life after death. Or at least we assume that from the way they buried their dead. So that's always been that human question. The personal answer of why I believe in a God and science claims all this, well, first I don't think science has proven there's no God, or has proven there is a God. But the personal answer I have is that I find in the Christian faith, rooted in Jesus, a way of life and an answer to the basic questions of my existence. that I can find no place else. That's where I choose to bend the knee. I do not find any other answer that comes close to what is the purpose of life, what allows for joy and love and compassion, and what builds community. I've spent almost 50 years studying the teachings of Jesus, and the more I study, the more I realize how profound that is. And as I said earlier, the tragedy is that most of it never filters down to the church. But there's a perspective, an insight, an assumption that he has that I don't find anyplace else, at least the way he puts it together. There are other religions that talk about love, but he puts a focus on love of enemies. Now, they too can talk about love of enemies, but they do not make it primary as he does. And that's a challenge. It's not only a comfort, it can be a challenge, especially if you have terrible enemies. He looks at life and says that life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions. And yet I live in a culture which says, Jesus, you're a liar. It does. It's all about possessions. It's all about wealth. It's all about money. He said you can't serve God and mammon. You can't serve God and wealth. He didn't say you shouldn't. He said you can't. And he saw money, wealth, as the primary idol that human beings are tempted to worship. And we see the devastating effects of that today. 99% of all the opioids taken in the world today are taken in the United States. Why is it we have to tranquilize ourselves? Why, in this supposedly the richest country in the world, why do we have to numb ourselves to get through life? Obviously we're not finding purpose and meaning. And yet you find it there with him. The more you will look into him, the deeper you will understand his understanding of both God and humanity, and what works and what doesn't, and what we're about. He's very honest about the price we'll pay in following him. Unlike many religious leaders today in the church who promise everything. No, he says, if you follow me, you may end up on a cross. But he still sees that as the most humane way to live, as well as the most faithful way to God. So from a personal perspective, that's why I remain within the church. I've always had a love-hate relationship with the church. It's where I first learned about Jesus, and I should be thankful for that. But I also see all the distortions that the church has made. But I think there's a movement now in churches that is very encouraging. And my wife and I happen to be a part of a church that is in that movement, that is very open to all and very progressive in its thinking, and realizes that the Christian faith is more about the life you live and how you love than it is about what you believe. Because people can believe different things. You can believe everything that certain church authorities tell you you must believe and still live a very unchristian life. And you can be someone like Gandhi, who was not a Christian, but who was so affected by the teachings of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount, that he perhaps lived a far more Christ-like life than most of us. So the focus, I think, in the future is going to be on the life you live and not what you believe. Because you can believe everything correctly and still totally miss the point.
What would you like to say about the Bible, the view or your understanding of the Bible? A lot of us are raised with the idea that, the Bible is God's Word and to be followed, and it's inerrant, and it's the source of all ultimate authority for our lives. If that's been your understanding, if that's how a person's grown up, what would you like to share with them that you've learned?
Yes. In all the teaching that I've done and pastoring, I've never had anyone show me a verse where the Bible itself claims to be infallible and inerrant. The most I will get is someone will quote from Paul's, or whoever wrote 2 Timothy, all Scripture is inspired. And my answer to that is anyone can be inspired. Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired. Even I can be inspired. That doesn't mean I'm infallible and inerrant. So we have people claiming something for the Bible it never claims for itself. The second point I would make is the Bible is not the Word, Jesus is the Word. First chapter of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Then later, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is the Word, not a book. Third point I would make is Abraham is considered the greatest example of faith in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the New Testament. Read in the book of Hebrews where you have this list of the heroes of the faith, and Abraham outshines all of them. Abraham had no Bible, no book, nothing he could quote. What he had was his trust in God. The next point I would make is if we believe that, as Christians, that Jesus is the greatest revelation of God, does that also mean, which I think it does, every other revelation is secondary? So everything that's come before that, it may have a lot of truth to it, but Jesus is the ultimate revelation. There's a progressive revelation in the Bible. It's not always like this. Sometimes it's like, it goes up and down, but you have a trajectory that moves toward this inclusive love and justice and peace and compassion you see in Jesus. If Jesus is the greatest revelation of God, then that's what we take the most seriously. But if you believe the Bible is infallible and inerrant, and every single word is infallible and inerrant, and every single word is as valuable as every other word, and I've heard that from many people, then you can never really appreciate the uniqueness of the revelation of Jesus. Because they see it all the same. That doesn't work very well. And so the result is you have people saying, well, here in the Old Testament, God goes in and says, kill every man, woman, child, and animal. God's in favor of war. We should be in war, You got Jesus saying, love your enemies. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He says to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my disciples would fight. But my kingdom is not of this world. You can't square what he says with what you have in the Hebrew Scriptures at that point. If you try to make it fit, you practice what I call pretzel logic. It's so twisted nobody would believe it. So there's a saying from John Dominic Crossan, a New Testament scholar, and I wish I'd come up with it. It's a wonderful quip. He says, Jesus trumps the Bible. Whenever you have something in the Bible that is contrary to the message, character, life, and death, and resurrection of Jesus, Jesus trumps it. I almost hate to use the word trump in this conversation, but you get what I mean. If we're a Christian, that's what we believe. Now, that doesn't mean the Hebrew Scriptures have no value. Jesus was a Jew. Judaism is the mother of Christianity. You don't kick your mother. There's so much we can learn from the Hebrew Scriptures, and Jesus assumes a lot of that. But he interprets it according to the way he understands who God is as Abba. And so he will leave out certain things when he's quoting a passage that do not fit what he thinks of that God would want, especially violence and vengeance and things like that. He leaves that out. He only quotes those parts that fit what he understands God to be. And so we have to ask the question, who is Jesus? That he knows better than Moses and the prophets and all this? Of course, that's a faith question. And I think that what I've come to the conclusion is that, yes, he is a unique revelation of God. And what we hear in him is the essence of who God is. So I think if you stick with the Bible as being infallible and inerrant, each part's just as valuable as the other part, you're going to miss out on the message. I like to see the Bible as something I can dialogue with, that I can question and let it question me. I like, as we mentioned earlier, I like to imagine parts of the Bible dialoguing with other parts of the Bible. For example, when the book of Deuteronomy talks about you obey God and everything is going to go great for your life, you'll live a long life, be healthy and wealthy. And then you get the book of Job, and Job was a great guy with he was a righteous man, it says. And he suffers incredibly. And the question is, why is he suffering? I would love to have those two people come together and dialogue about that and learn from one another. And I think we can do that with ourselves, with the Scripture, and together as a group, and see what we might learn from one another. A person who has experienced poverty and oppression and injustice is going to hear the Bible a lot different from the way we do, and probably hear it more authentically, because the audience, for example, that Jesus was speaking to, these are poor peasants who live a hand-to-mouth existence. They know what oppression is. In the United States, we don't know what oppression is. We're going to have a hard time hearing what the message is. So we need others to help us interpret it as well. The Bible is a wonderful book. It's an exciting book. It's a great collection of testimonies as to the way people perceive God and experience God. But it's not God. And unfortunately in Christianity we have now what is called bibliolatry, the worship of the Bible, which is a form of idolatry. I find it ironic that so many people are critical of Muslims because they are people of the Quran no matter what, and yet fundamentalist Christians are people of the Bible no matter what. They don't see the irony in that. As far as I know, Christianity is the only faith that is based on a person, not a book. The Christian Bible. And I think we need to remember that.
What would you say if someone feels like they see no value in organized religion? They want to be spiritual, but not religious.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people say that because they find no value in churches. The churches are theologically bankrupt and sometimes morally bankrupt. My answer to that is, going back to Jesus' teachings, I never think that Jesus assumed that what he taught, for example in the Sermon on the Mount, could be lived individually, in isolation. It can only be lived in community. He went, we know now, he rarely went into the cities. He went to these little villages and hamlets. And he created what Clarence Jordan, and if you don't know who Clarence Jordan is, find out. You will be amazed. Clarence Jordan said that Jesus went about creating demonstration plots. And he was speaking out of the experience of the Great Depression and World War II, when in order for people to eat and to survive, they had to plant their own gardens, and many of them didn't know how to do that. So the government came in, and my grandmother actually worked in one of those programs, and they created these demonstration plots of how to plant so you could have the vegetables and fruits that you need to survive. So Jordan said Jesus went about creating demonstration plots of the kingdom of God in these villages. And he never assumed that you could live his message by yourself. It's always live within a community, because you need that community for support, for help. You also need that community to keep you honest. You need the strength of that community to grow, because so many people I know who say that they're spiritual, you don't see much growth in them. It sort of stays the same. Now, you can say the same thing about most people in the church. That's not God's fault. That's the fault of the people in the church. They haven't grown any in their spirituality. They should be. If you're the same as you were 10 years ago, there's something wrong. We need each other in order to experience the kind of love and joy. We need each other for inspiration, for courage. We need each other to face the truth about ourselves and our world. You can't do that by yourself. Jesus even says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there will I be also. He understands you can't do it alone. The Lord's Prayer is in the first person plural, not singular. It's not my Father. It's not my bread. It's not my debts. It's our. Unfortunately, in English, American English, there is no distinction in the word you between singular and plural. Now, I grew up in the South where it was you meant one person, y'all meant everybody. You never would say you to a group. It was always y'all. And people in the North laugh at that, but we actually are being true to what most languages understand, like French, Spanish, and German. They have different words for you singular, you plural. Most of the time, you on Jesus' lips is plural. He's talking to a group. He's not talking to an individual. We, as Protestants, have taken Christianity to such an individualistic extreme that we've lost touch with the gift of community. I do not think it's possible to live the Christian life in isolation. You have to live it within community. So I would say to the person who said they have no use for religious organizations or churches, there may be a lot of them that you have no use for, and you shouldn't have any use for them. But there are those out there that I think you would find will give you a perspective, a strength, a love. You will not feel alone. You will find so much courage and joy that it would behoove you to look in that direction and to understand that the essence of religion is how we're connected. That's what it's all about. To me, true spirituality is about understanding how we are connected to God, each other, and the universe. And so that connection implies a community. Now, it can't be a closed community. It always has to be an open community. But it is in community that you grow in your faith, provided the community is committed to that. So that, again, is why I encourage people to find a place of worship, of faith, that is open and evolving and growing and caring, and above all, loving and compassionate. And see what happens to that spirituality that you have.
If you could recommend a couple of authors, a couple of books, what would you say is a good place to start, so someone could understand what you've been talking about?
Some of the easiest reading you can do, and yet most profound, and you don't realize it till you put it down, is by the writer Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren came out of a conservative evangelical background, and then his faith grew. And he has a background in English literature. he writes beautifully. Every time I read him, I want to say, I wish I'd written that. The book that I would recommend people start with is The Secret Message of Jesus. That's the book that will show you what I'm talking about when I talk about Jesus being the best kept secret of the church. Now, I preached that sermon long before he wrote that book, and I've been saying that ever since I got out of seminary, that Jesus is the best kept secret, and we need to know who he is. But McLaren does a very good job of not only explaining who Jesus was and what he said and what he meant, but also what does that mean for us today. Then you could read any of his other books. He wrote several that were meant to be read in succession. And they are written somewhat as novels, but mainly as dialogues. And they're very good. A New Kind of Christian is, I think, the first in that series. You can find the others related to that. He even wrote one that dealt with eschatology, the last things, which is very good. He also wrote a book called A New Kind of Christianity. The other one is New Kind of Christian. This is A New Kind of Christianity. It's a theological book. It's very good. His latest book is called The Great Spiritual Migration. And in many ways, I think it's his best book. But if you wanted to start, The Secret Message of Jesus and then The Great Spiritual Migration are the two that I would recommend, especially for people who have had bad experiences in the church, people who don't know where to go to now, who can't accept what they were taught early on, but they're still hungry for something. He would be a good source for that, and you will find in the footnotes all other kinds of things you can read.
Thanks so much. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you.